The restaurant was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over places meant for conversation but rarely receives it. It wasn't a fancy place, just a small, family-owned diner tucked into the corner of a sleepy neighborhood, but it had been our spot growing up. The faded red booths still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and burnt coffee, and the jukebox in the corner hadn't worked in years. Still, there was something comforting about the familiarity of it all. Or maybe that was just nostalgia talking. I arrived first, as I always did, slipping into the booth farthest from the door. The table wobbled slightly, just like it used to, and I steadied it with a napkin folded under one leg. My fingers traced the grooves on the tabletop where someone, probably one of us, had carved initials decades ago. I didn't need to look at my watch to know she'd be late. She always was, even when we were kids. Punctuality had never been her strong suit. When Sarah finally walked in, she paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room until her eyes landed on me. For a moment, she looked almost hesitant, like she might turn around and leave. But then she forced a smile, smoothing her hands down the front of her coat before making her way over.
"Hey,"
she said softly, sliding into the seat across from me. Her voice carried an edge of uncertainty, the kind that made you wonder if she regretted coming at all. "Hey," I replied, matching her tone. There was so much unsaid between us, layers of history and hurt that neither of us seemed willing or able to unpack. Instead, we sat in silence, staring at the menus propped up between us like shields. The waitress appeared eventually, breaking the tension with her cheerful greeting. We ordered quickly, defaulting to old favorites without really thinking about it. A burger for me, grilled cheese for her. Fries to share. It felt automatic, like muscle memory kicking in despite everything else that had changed. "So," Sarah began after the waitress left, fiddling with the straw wrapper in her hands.
"How have you been?"
It was such a loaded question, disguised as casual small talk. How had I been? Fine, mostly. Busy with work, distracted by life's endless demands. Lonely sometimes, though I'd never admit that out loud, but none of those answers felt right here, not now. So instead, I shrugged. "You know, same old stuff." She nodded, though her expression suggested she didn't entirely believe me.
"Yeah, same."
Another stretch of silence followed, punctuated only by the clink of silverware against plates at neighboring tables. Outside, rain began tapping gently against the windows, blurring the view of the street beyond. It suited the mood somehow, softening the sharp edges of our discomfort. "You remember this place?" I asked finally, gesturing vaguely around us. "We used to come here all the time." Sarah glanced around, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile.
"Yeah, Mom hated it because Dad would always bring home leftovers he swore were perfectly good."
She laughed lightly, but it sounded brittle, like glass teetering on the verge of shattering.
"Remember the time he tried to smuggle half a pie out in his jacket pocket?"
I chuckled despite myself, the memory rising unbidden. And it leaked everywhere. He spent the whole car ride complaining about how sticky his shirt was. For a fleeting moment, it felt like old times, like we were kids again, sitting in the same booth while Dad argued with the waitress about splitting checks and Mom rolled her eyes dramatically. But the illusion shattered as quickly as it formed, leaving behind the stark reality of who we were now. Two estranged siblings trying and failing could die to bridge a chasm years in the making. Our food arrived then, steaming hot and smelling faintly of grease. We ate in relative silence, the occasional comment about the weather or some mundane detail of daily life filling the gaps. It was safe territory, neutral ground where neither of us risked stepping on any emotional landmines. But safety wasn't why we were here, was it? Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. Setting down my burger, I wiped my mouth with a napkin and leaned back in the booth. "Why did you agree to meet me, Sarah?" She froze mid-bite, her fork hovering halfway to her mouth. Slowly, she lowered it back to her plate, avoiding my gaze.
"I don't know.
She admitted quietly.
Maybe, because I thought it was time."
Time for what? I pressed, though I already knew the answer. Time to face whatever it was we'd both been running from for so long. She sighed, running a hand through her hair.
Look, Evan, I'm not saying this is easy for me. You disappeared, okay? Just packed up and left without even saying goodbye. Do you have any idea how that felt?
Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, sharp and unexpected. I didn't disappear, I countered, though my voice lacked conviction. I needed space. Things were complicated.
Complicated?
She echoed, her tone laced with disbelief.
That's your excuse? You bailed on us, on me, and now you act like it's no big deal.
It wasn't like that, I insisted, though guilt gnawed at the edges of my resolve. She wasn't wrong, not entirely. After Mom died, everything fell apart. Dad retreated into himself, drowning his grief in cheap whiskey and reruns of old sitcoms. And me? I ran. Ran as far and as fast as I could, telling myself I needed to start fresh to escape the suffocating weight of loss. But in doing so, I'd abandoned the one person who understood exactly how I felt. I'm sorry, I said finally, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. I should have stayed. Should have been there for you. Sarah studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she shook her head, not angrily but resignedly.
It's not just about being there, Evan. It's about trust, about showing up when it matters most, and you didn't.
Her honesty stung, but it also felt necessary, like lancing a wound to let the poison out. You're right, I admitted. I screwed up. I let my own pain blind me to yours, but I'm here now. Doesn't that count for something? She didn't answer immediately, instead reaching for her water glass and taking a slow sip. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, tinged with sadness rather than anger.
I don't know, Evan. Maybe. But trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. It takes time, effort, and honestly, I'm not sure either of us has the energy for that anymore.
Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. I wanted to argue, to convince her that we could fix this, that we owed it to ourselves and to Mom to try. But deep down, I knew she was right. Too much time had passed, too many bridges burned. Some wounds don't heal cleanly. They scar over, leaving behind reminders of what once was. The rest of the meal passed in a haze, each bite feeling heavier than the last. By the time the check arrived, neither of us had much appetite left. Sarah reached for her purse, but I stopped her, placing a hand over hers. "Let me get this," I said quietly. "Please." She hesitated, then nodded, pulling her hand away. As I paid the bill, I noticed her standing near the door, gazing out at the rain-soaked street. For a moment, I considered joining her, saying something, anything that might change the trajectory of this night. But what could I possibly say that would undo years of silence and regret? Instead, I grabbed my coat and joined her outside, the cool air wrapping around us like a second skin. "Take care of yourself, okay?" I said finally, the words inadequate but sincere.
You too,
she replied, offering a small, sad smile. And then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the misty evening. I stood there for a while, watching until her figure faded completely. The rain picked up, soaking through my jacket, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was how much I'd lost. Not just Sarah, but the version of myself who believed family could survive anything. Maybe forgiveness was possible someday. Maybe not. Either way, I knew one thing for certain. The past couldn't be rewritten. All we could do was carry it forward, hoping it wouldn't weigh us down forever. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, fragments of the evening replayed in my mind like scenes from an old movie. Sarah's voice, brittle yet determined. The way she'd refused to meet my eyes during the hardest parts of our conversation. The sound of her footsteps fading into the distance as she walked away. But alongside the ache of loss, there was something else. A flicker of clarity. Meeting her hadn't fixed anything, not really. But it had reminded me of something important. Relationships aren't defined solely by their endings. They're shaped by moments, the laughter, the fights, the silences that speak louder than words. And while ours might never return to what it once was, it wasn't entirely gone either. Not yet. With that thought lingering in my mind, I drifted off to sleep, the rain still pattering softly against the window. Somewhere out there, Sarah was probably doing the same. Two siblings, miles apart but connected still, carrying pieces of each other into the uncertain future.